Good day, everyone. This is Chill, and I will be your host for today to continue chapter 2 of the book entitled The Last Sin Eater, written by Francine Rivers. Chapter 1 was already read yesterday, so I will just give a recap for my podcast. I will recap chapter 1 after I finish all of the videos for until we reach the last chapter. Chapter 2. It was 3 days after Granny Forbes was laid to rest that I met Lilibeth in the forest. Papa and Ivan had been out working, and I had been left alone with Mama's silence. I had done my chores and sat watching her spinning wool. The whir and click of the wheel, the only sign of life from her. No words passed between us, not even a look. I was low and melancholy from abiding under the shadow of death. "Can I do anything for you, Mama?" She looked at me, and her pain was terrible to see. I had cracked the shield of silence that protected her, and her heart spilled out through her eyes. I knew she couldn't abide me so close in her grieving. In truth, my presence only served to rekindle her sorrow and tighten the chains around her heart. She was held captive in her losses and found no pleasure or even solace in my existence. I thought then it would have been better had I died. It was all I could think about on that sunny day, warm and clear, with the mists burned away. I yearned for things to be different, for time to roll back, and knew it couldn't. Desperate to help Mama in any small way, I took the basket from the porch, intending to fill it with garden sass. I knew just where to go for it. For while Granny had still walked this earth, she had shown me where to find the savory greens and roots that added to our homegrown meals. Ramps grew aplenty under the maples in the cove. The pungent scented bulbs added fine flavor to Mama's soups and stews. Turkey cress grew in the woods above the house. In the meadowlands below was brook lettuce, blue violet, and dock. I had all we needed and more long before the sun had reached its high place overhead. I thought of leaving the basket like an offering on the front porch, knowing Mama would find it when she ventured outside to wash clothes or weed and water the garden. Yet hopelessness gripped me. What good would it do? Was there any offering I could give that would buy back time and undo what was done? No, I had to live with my sins at least until I died and the sin eater could come and take them away. If Mama would let him. It was then that I turned toward the river, which was running high from the melting winter snows. The water was cold as I waded in, and so clear I could see the orange, brown, and black pebbles and ribbons of green moss on the bottom. Small fish shot past me, keeping to their hiding places in the rocks until I disturbed them. If I had a fishing pole, maybe I could catch a big one and bring it home for supper. I paused to think about it, the ache in my feet growing until they were numb. Seeing a big trout swaying in the current, I became less inclined to think of it as supper. It was beautiful, swimming there so gracefully and doing no one any harm. Besides, its death would not elevate me in Mama's eyes. It'd be food soon forgotten with the next pang of hunger. What could I offer to earn forgiveness? I was sore with hopelessness, grieving my own losses, and it was in that frame of mind that I began talking to myself in the wood, keeping myself company. Most of what I said was simple, nonsense, just sounds to fill the void my loneliness was growing, and to build my courage as I ventured further from home. I was making a decision and needed counsel. I thought then there was no other to listen but myself. Ivan could not encourage me, and Papa would not want to be bothered. Work was his salvation. So, seeking answers, I followed the river down to the fallen tree that bridged the narrows not far above the falls. It was there my life had changed, and it was there I could make amends for what had happened. I talked with myself as I went. You shouldn't be here, Caddy. You've been warned to keep away. I have to be here. You know I have to see. Yes, I know, child, but it's dangerous. It's no place for little girls to play. I'm not going to play. I left the basket on the flat rock and climbed on the upturned roots of that great old pine, then sat down. A sick fear gripped my throat as I held tight to the root chair. The palms of my hands were slick with sweat. Thinking of Mama spinning in silence, her face so pale and forlorn, helped me gather courage. After a little while, the river's roar seemed distant. A little longer, and it beckoned. Closing my eyes, I imagined walking out on that rough bark bridge. I imagined standing in the middle with my arms spread like wings. I imagined flinging myself out like a bird in flight, arching. Suspended for a moment before I plunged downward into the white foam and churning currents that crashed over boulders. I imagined what it would be like dipping, rising, swirling, and being swept over the falls. I imagined going down into that deep blue pool below. And then I imagined my body floating onward and going wherever the river ran, never to be found again. Papa said it poured into the sea so far away, so deep, so wide, I could not even imagine it. All I knew was I would be lost forever. Lost and forgotten. Granny was gone now. I was alone. There was no one left to lead me out of the wilderness of my circumstances or the blight upon my soul. There was no one to love me back from the edge as Granny had done daily since last summer. I kept thinking, oh God, if only I could die, maybe then the sin eater would come and take my sins away. Oh God, would that he could do it now while my heart beats and I still breathe, so I would not have to live with pain. And then she came, sudden and unexpected, like a shaft of light as the sun starts coming up over the mountain. Hello, Katrina Annis, she said in a voice soft and sweet. Opening my eyes, I looked around and saw a little girl younger than me sitting beside the basket I'd left on the flat rock. She stood and came toward me. If you want to cross the river, there's a better place back in the meadowlands below your house. Let's cross over there. Cocking my head, I stared at her, having no recollection of ever seeing her before. She had a cloud of golden hair that curled about her face and shoulders, and her eyes were very blue. They reminded me of what Granny had said about Ian Forbes' eyes, and I got to wondering if she was some far-off and forgotten relative. And then I wondered how she came to be sitting there with nary a warning at her coming. She just appeared, quiet as a drifting bird, and called me Katrina Annis. It was a pretty name, though not my own. Caddy, that was my given name. Simple Caddy Forbes, and nothing else. Oh, but I liked Katrina Annis so much better. It sounded like a name much thought on before its hinges were set in place. Wouldn't it be nice to be someone special, someone loved? It would be a great relief to be anyone other than Caddy Forbes, even if just for a little while. I'm Lilibet, she said when I stayed in my solemn silence. My father told me about you. That surprised me. He did? I had no idea who her father was. Yes, she rose and stood in front of me. I know all about what happened, Katrinanis. Her expression was so tender I felt as though love reached out to encircle me in gentle arms. I know everything about you. Lowering my head, I looked down into the river again. Everybody knows. My throat closed, hot with tears. Everybody knows something, Katrinanis. But who knows everything? Lifting my head, I looked at her again, perplexed. God knows. God will judge. That did not bear contemplation. God is a consuming fire. She smiled at me. I want to be your friend. The ache inside my heart eased a little. Maybe just for a little while, I would feel reprieved. Where'd you came from? Someplace far away and near. I giggled, amused by her conversation. You're very strange. She laughed, and the sound was like birdsong and a cleansing stream. The same has been said of you, Katrinanis, but I think we understand one another very well, don't we? Aye, we do that. And even better given time. Retrieving the basket, I headed back with her, climbing the rocks along the river, ducking beneath low, leafy branches. Returning to the meadowlands, we sat on a warm sandy bank and skipped stones. I talked, a flood of words after a long drought, and I dreamed too of times ahead. Mama would laugh again, and Papa would play his dulcimer, and Ivan would dance. Lilibet had called me Katrina Nis, and the name offered a new beginning. Like Granny, she seemed to love me without cause. And though I knew in my heart I was undeserving, I grasped Lilibet's offer of friendship with both hands and survived in it. I took Lilibet home with me that first day, thinking to share the joy with Mama. But she paid Lilibet no mind, never even looking once at her. Not that this surprised me, for she didn't look at me anymore either. Papa was not comforted by her presence. He didn't like strangers about the place, and Lilibet was as strange and inexplicable besides. She was unlike anyone I had ever met before or would ever meet again. Even Ivan was disturbed by her. Maybe you shouldn't spend so much time talking with Lilibet, Caddy, he said several days after Lilibet first came. Leastwise not around Mama and Papa. You can, my dear. I did understand and took his gentle advice to heart. It was in Lilibet's company that I decided I must find the Sin Eater. The idea so fixed itself in my head that I thought of little else. Where do you think he might be, Lilibet? He'll be someplace where no one can easily find him. I couldn't ask Mama about the Sin Eater for fear of what words she might lay upon my head for more disobedience. After all, Gervais Odara had commanded me not to look at the man, and my own cursed curiosity had done me in. As for Papa, well, he had such a dark countenance most times that approaching him about anything took more courage than I possessed. Yet I was plagued about the Sin Eater. Finally, I sought Ivan out as he was repairing a harness. Why for are you asking on him? He seemed such a sorry old soul. And rightful so. He's taken enough sin upon himself to curse him for all eternity. But why would he do it, Ivan? How should I know, my dear? Oh, Ivan, why would he so forsake himself and give his soul over to hell? He lowered the scrap of leather and looked at me grimly. You shouldn't have been asking about that man, Caddy. Where would poor Granny be without him, eh? You shouldn't be thinking on him with pity. He's gone now. He will not come back until he's needed again. Now go in and go on with you and play. I've work to do, and it's too fine a spring day for a little girl to be thinking such heavy thoughts. Ivan could be as firm as Brogan Kai was commanding. They both said the same thing. Forget him. How could I forget him when he had looked at me and set his claws into my very soul? For every time I thought of the man, my wounded heart ached. He didn't even have a name but was called by what he did, Sin Eater. Dear to goodness, even thinking about him made my flesh grow cold and prickly. Yet I had to know who he was and how he came to be, and if he could rescue me. It got so I couldn't sleep at night without dreaming about the man. He would come to me in the darkness, in the darkest time just before dawn, and say, "Who'll take my sins away, Caddy Forbes?" And he would reach out for me, waking me up in a cold sweat. During my wanderings with Lilibet, I saw Fagin Kai, Colin Hume, and Carl's sister Glynis on the river bank. They'd built a small fire and were roasting fish, creeping closer. I watched them for some time from the green and pink veiling of rhododendrons and a blooming serviceberry tree. The boys were spear fishing, Fagin having all the luck. "Why don't you go down and ask them about the Sin Eater?" Lilibet said, but even thinking about it made me tremble. "I'm fine right here," I whispered. "I can hear what they're saying, and I could watch Fagin." "He's very handsome," Lilibet said. "Aye, he's a nice boy. He's a friend of Ivan's. They've gone hunting together." Fagin was standing on a rock in the middle of the stream, holding a spear high. "There's a big one swimming for you," Glynis pointed excitedly. "Quiet or you'll scare mine away," her brother said in disgust. "Why don't you go back and help Mama make soap? You're making more noise than I am," Glynis said, lower jaw jutting. "And besides that, you couldn't spare the cow, even tied up." Fagin hurled the sharpened branch and gave a yelp of triumph. Stepping into the water, he raised his spear with a wriggling fish on the end. "You did it! You did it!" Glynis clapped and jumped up and down excitedly. So impressed was I with his prowess. I stood startling Glynis, who startled Carl, who then missed his fish. "You're lucky I don't have a gun, Caddy Forbes. I might have shot you for an Injun." Red-faced, he waded into the water to retrieve his sharpened stick. Fagin told him to be quiet. "It's her fault I missed." Fagin waded back to shore with his catch. I said, "Leave her be, Carl." He looked up at me, standing at a distance. "What are you doing this far afield, Caddy Forbes?" "Go on and tell him, Katrina Annis," Lilibet whispered, still concealed among the leafy branches behind me. "Maybe he'll help you." "She made me miss," Carl said, the spear gripped in his hand. Fagin turned on him. "This is Kai land, and I decide who's welcome. If you cannot hold your tongue, get your gear and go." He yanked his fish from the spear and bent down to slip a thin piece of rope through its gills and out its mouth. Dropping it back into the water, he left it drifting with two others. "I didn't say she wasn't welcome," Carl said sullenly. "I just don't like people sneaking up on me is all." "I didn't mean to scare you, Colin Hugh." Carl's face darkened. "I wasn't scared." "Yes, you were," Glynis laughed. "Your face went white as the underbelly of that fish." Carl turned on his sister, and with a shrieking laugh she darted away. At a safe distance she taunted him more. Colin was scared. Colin was scared. When he pitched a rock at her, she ducked. Straightening again, she stuck out her tongue at him and continued the harangue. "You missed me! You missed me!" "On purpose," he shouted at her. "If I hit you, you'd just go crying home to Mama." Turning his back on her, he glared at me as though all his misery was my fault. And maybe it was, since I was the one who'd startled him in the first place and given Glynis the ammunition for torment. "So," Fagin said, "what are you doing on Kai land?" He was looking square at me. I wasn't thinking on whose land I was. I was just following the river. "Following to where?" I shrugged, for I wasn't sure I could trust them with my quest. Carl seemed downright unfriendly. Though Fagin was playing gentleman, he might tire of it quick enough if I mentioned the Sin Eater. After a minute of waiting for an answer, Fagin gave a shrug and headed out to the fishing rock again. "When are you going to quit?" Carl called out to him. "When I've got me one more." "That's what you said about the last one." "Caddy'll need one to roast over the coals." I blushed, embarrassed by Carl's resentful stare. "Thank you kindly, Fagin Kai, but I gotta be going." I edged toward the woods. "Stand fast, it'll only take me a few minutes." Fagin stood poised on the rock, his spear raised once more. One didn't ignore the command of a Kai, be he the father, Brogan, or one of his 3 sons. Even this one, the youngest and least, commanded deference. I stood as I'd been told, wishing I had never let myself be seen, while at the same time glad to have gained some small bit of attention from one so important in our mountains. I had always been drawn to this boy. He measured up to Ivan. Fagin cast his spear and leaned forward quickly. Grabbing the end, he lifted it high, sporting a writhing fish on the end. I expected him to give a yelp of triumph, as he had before, but this time he returned to the riverbank with an air of dignity. Glynis came back, giving over her badgering of her brother. She admired Fagin's catch with fulsome words, and then turned a jaundiced eye upon me. "Does your mama know where you are?" "She doesn't mind my wandering." Colin gave a short laugh. "I heard she ain't been right in the head since." I ran for the woods. Fagin called out to me, but I didn't stop. I was not going to stand and hear the rest of what Colin Hume had to say. Fagin Kai or no Fagin Kai. Diving into the leafy branches, I raced between the trees, heading up the hill and along the wooded hillside. "Caddy!" Ducking into some thick bushes, I crouched down, out of breath, sitting as far back in the leafy cave as I could. I drew my knees up tight against my chest and waited, scrubbing the tears from my eyes. "You cannot let words hurt you so," Lilibet whispered. Words could be sharper than a two-edged sword. They cut deep and left me bleeding. I tensed and held my breath as I heard footsteps coming my way. "Caddy!" Fagin stood not far from my refuge. He looked around slowly. "Caddy, where are you, girl?" He stood quiet for a long moment, his head cocked slightly, like a cornered rabbit. I remained still. "Colin, sorry. He didn't mean anything. He's just sore because he ain't caught a fish today." "Come on out, Caddy. You must have a good reason to be so far afield. Say something, Katrina Nanis. Maybe you and Fagin and the others can find the Sin Eater." "I'm your friend, ain't I, Caddy Forbes?" "Are you?" I said from my hiding place. He turned sharply, looking into my direction, but I could tell he hadn't seen me. "Go out, Caddy," Lilibet said. "Be silent," I whispered to her. "Go on, out to him." "No, he may know something that would help." "What could he know?" You won't know until you ask. Now, will you?" Pushing the branches aside, I stood up. He grinned at me. "You ran faster than a deer, you know." Pressing my way through the shrubs, I stood in front of him, my cheeks hot. "You didn't have to follow." "No, I didn't," he said and nodded his head in the direction of the river. "Come on back." We didn't say anything to one another on the way. I began to regret taking Lilibet's advice. Colin and Glynis were roasting fish. "I didn't mean nothing," Colin said and handed me a long stick with a trout. It had been gutted and cleaned. I thanked him and sat down to roast it. Glynis talked about helping catch the fish by scaring them toward the boys holding the spears. "Fagin's done it before," Colin said. "He's teaching me. You'll do better next time." Fagin tossed the fish head with skeleton attached into the brush. I learned from my brothers. They used to plague me something awful about my aim. Took a sight of time to learn just when and how to throw. You'll catch on, Colin. "What are you doing so far from your house?" Glynis looked at me with curious interest. Taking a deep breath, I let it out slowly, hoping my heart would slow down and drop back into its rightful rhythm. "I'm trying to find out about the Sin Eater." Colin swore exactly like his father. "The Sin Eater? What are you doing wanting to find out about the likes of him?" He's a monster. Glennie's eyes were wide. He has fire-red eyes like the devil, and long fangs like a wolf, and his hands are claws. I knew that was not so, but said nothing about it. Glynis would want to know how I knew, and I was loath to admit I had looked at the accursed man when he was taking Granny's sins upon himself. I had seen no fangs, but that didn't mean he had none. He had surely eaten like a ravenous wolf. Who told you these things? Why, my mamma did. He must have been a man once, Fagin said. A man who gave himself to the devil, Colin said. He loves sin. He spends his whole life looking for it so he can feast on it. Maybe that isn't so, I said. He sounded so awful sorrowful after eating my granny's sins. And he called her dear, as though he cared for her. Fagin, Cole, and Glynis said nothing for a long moment. Fagin was staring off toward the mountains, frowning slightly. I wonder where he lives. No one knows. Colin shrugged. Only time he ever comes into the cove is when the passing bell rings for somebody. I'd be afraid to go looking for him, Glynis said. He must be somewhere close enough to hear the ringing. Fagin said, still contemplating the mountains. Maybe up there somewhere. He pointed toward the highest mountain to the west. My father's always told me to keep away from those mountains. Could be he lives up one of them hollows. Glynis shook her head. Couldn't hear nothing if he did. Well, maybe someone tells him when someone's died. Who says he hears the bell? Colin said. Who'd it be? I said. Gervais O'Dara, maybe. He shrugged. He's the one who'd know if someone was dying. Her being the healer and all. Maybe she tells him. I thought about that. Maybe I could talk with her when she was visiting with Elda Kendrick. She was there every few days with a remedy to ease the old woman's swollen joints. She used to come by our house and visit with Mama, but that was a long while ago. Your Mama don't make people welcome no more, Glynis said. Mama said she's so deep in grieving over her dead that she ain't got time anymore for the living. They all looked at me. I wasn't comforted by their attention. I hadn't come to pity but to find out anything I could about the Sin Eater. It appeared to me they didn't know much more than I. Everything they'd said so far was guessing, and I could do that all by myself. I looked up at the mountains to the west and wondered if he was up there somewhere. Seems a lonely place. Maybe he ain't far away at all. Colin said. Fagin got up and washed his hands in the river. Colin could be right. Who's to say the Sin Eater stays up on a mountain? Maybe he comes down and watches people. He could be watching us right now. Glynis shuddered and looked around, face paling. I wish you hadn't said that, Fagin. I ain't going to sleep nights now wondering if he's peering in our windows. Maybe he knows when someone's going to die. The thought clearly troubled Fagin. Colin tossed his fish bones into the fire. Maybe he's like the wolves sensing when an animal's sick. He can smell death coming and prowls around until he can feast on it. He didn't come when Ellen died, I said. Fagin sat down again. There was no need. She wasn't old enough to have done anything wrong. That was not the only reason, of course, but he was kind enough not to say it. I blinked back tears. Granny told me once that all of us are sinners. They taught her that back in Wales. If he didn't come, it must mean she didn't have any sins big enough to need any eating. Fagin's tone was soothing. He knows when he's to come, Caddy. The night of your granny's funeral, Mama said the Sin Eater knows when he's needed. Did he? Was he out there somewhere watching us? Were his eyes fixed upon me? You're going to eat that fish, Colin said to me. I handed him the stick with a half-eaten fish. Why don't we look for him? Fagin said. Colin's head came up. If he so much as looks at you with his evil eye, you're dead. No, you're not, I said before I thought better of it. 3 pairs of eyes turned on me, wide and questioning. I blushed and put my head down on my knees. You look at him, didn't you? Fagin said. I opened the door to more grief and disregard. Would he tell my brother first chance he had? Glynis drew back slightly. Didn't you know you're not supposed to look at him, Caddy Forbes? Didn't anyone tell you? I couldn't help myself, he sounded so sorrowful. He gave you the evil eye, didn't he? Cullen cringed back. Oh, you're in it now. You're in it. I jumped up, standing over them. He didn't have red eyes, and his hands were fine and clean, not claws at all. And his teeth? Cullen leaned forward. What about his teeth? I didn't see his teeth. My passion was spent, and I looked away. He was wearing a hood with eye holes and a flap over his mouth. He was probably hiding them, Cullen said, and sank his teeth into the rest of my fish. He must be a monster for all the sin he's eaten, Glynis said. That must be why he covers his face, Fagin said. Whoever he is, he's been the sin eater since before I was born. Glynis shook her head. Could we talk about somewhat else? Now who's scared? Cullen said smugly. So what if I am? You ought to be too. She looked at me warily. You shouldn't talk about him at all, Katie Forbes. Somewhat terrible could happen to you. Talking about him ain't going to bring him down on her head, Fagin said. Who's to say? Glynis looked at him. You don't know what could come of it. And you do? I know enough to know he's evil, and no good can come of even thinking on him. Why don't you run back to Mama? Cullen taunted. If I do, I'm going to tell her what you're all talking about, and I'll tell her you're a liar, and she'll take a switch to both of you, Fagin said. I sat silent, feeling the prickles of fear rising. Why had I trusted them? If Glynis went home and told her mother we were talking about the sin eater, her mother would want to know how they dared. Katie Forbes, that's who dared, and Katie Forbes hadn't just dared talked about him. She had looked at him. Oh, I had sins aplenty on my head, and here was another. I could not go through a day without committing another grievous error. Glynis is right. I hoped I hadn't done them harm. I'm sorry I said anything about him. Just forget it. It was my trouble, and I would sort it out. You'll have to pray, Glynis said. Pray hard to Almighty God that the evil don't take hold of you. I know. I had done a lot of praying over the past year, but I didn't think God was listening. I held more hope in Granny's prayers on my behalf than anything I had said on my own. And Granny was gone. There was no one to intercede for me now. I didn't linger with them long after that, but made my excuses and headed back. Lilibet met me on the trail. They don't know any more than I do, I said to her. Are you going to give over looking for the sin eater? I considered it as I headed home. Maybe it was a poor idea trying to find someone who was so much an outcast. Yet wasn't I? Not an outcast from the community, but from my mother's heart. And maybe Papa's too. For that matter, though he didn't make it as a parent, he could talk to me without that heart-split look in his eyes. Maybe men didn't feel as deeply as women, yet feeling as I did. I could not leave it as it was. I had to seek the man out, whatever the cost. Lilibet seemed pleased that I had not given up my quest. Do you know what you'll ask him when you meet? I've not thought that far ahead. Think it through then, Katrina Anis. I think you'll come upon him sooner than you think. When I looked at her hoping for an explanation, she just smiled at me, her eyes alight with promise. Thank you for joining me in reading Chapter 2 of the book The Last Sin Eater, a novel written by Francine Rivers. Thanks again for staying tuned. Till then, have a blessed day. Bye!